Okay, one second. And press the whole thing. Okay,
The Greek economic crisis turned very quickly into a social catastrophe, and we've never had one of those in modern Europe. We've never seen a country not just experience a collapse in output, which it did, and a massive rise in unemployment, which it did, but the breakdown of a lot of social mechanisms. Above all, because Greece is a country that went through World War II, went through the 60s in a quite unmodernized way, was, even though it's massively urban, quite a rural culture. That is, there's lots of family stuff going on, there's a lot of church stuff going on, there are a lot of closely knit networks that then got really tested by the crisis because they had to hold society together as politics and as work and as government slightly fell apart. Look, as a journalist covering Greece, I started in 2010 at Davos in January 2010, watching Papandreou and Papakonstantinou, the Prime Minister and Finance Minister, basically spin out of control as the country's finances collapsed. At that point, I started saying to my bosses, look, something amazing is going to happen in Greece. This country is going to go to the edge of bankruptcy, and most likely it will go bankrupt. It didn't go bankrupt, but it defaulted on its debts in the end. Now, the media just doesn't know how to cover a situation where a Western country, a democratic country, goes through not just default, but social breakdown, collapse, the rapid rise of fascism, the rapid swing to the left of a previously quite left-minded electorate, the left half of the electorate, swung dramatically to the left, to a party that, for example, when I went to its HQ, on the eve, it missed winning the election by 1%. On the eve of that, it had its entire party records on a shelf that wide. That's how dramatic a change had been. And I just think the media just didn't understand what was going on. We all struggled to understand. Me, my colleagues, mainly economic journalists, were thrust into that situation. And I can remember even now standing on Syntagma Square in the middle of a riot saying, look, what's going on here is not a fight for Syntagma Square, it's a fight for the stability of the financial system. That was, in 2011, 2012, that was the situation.
Welcome back to those who've been here already for the fictions this afternoon, and welcome, though, to the new recruits to Greece is the Word. My name is Rosie Goldsmith, and I'm a journalist. One of the things I wanted to do with this day of Greek events here at the Southbank Centre is to include an element of current affairs. I'm a current affairs journalist, and one of the other things I wanted to do was to make sure that the person who presented this particular part of the day was Paul Mason. Paul then went and left the BBC after I said, please, Paul, come, be a colleague. We were both at the BBC. But he's joined Channel 4. And Paul, as you know, is a great Greek aficionado. He has written 2 books about the global economic crisis and the global protests, Meltdown and Why It's Still Kicking Off Everywhere. His books are on sale outside, as you know. Paul is going to chair a debate about the crisis in Greece and about how the media have been handling it. So I'm going to hand it over to Paul. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Rose.
Paul Mason.
Okay, so that's me introduced. The title of this session is Media Myths, but what we're going to be talking about is what happened in the Greek crisis, what its implications are, how the international media and international civil society has responded to it, what we think about the Greek media and the Greek reaction, the Greek narrative about its own plight, and where it goes. And that's a lot to cover in an hour. There won't be a Q&A, but there'll be a lot of Q&Aing and discussion going on between my guests, who I'll now introduce. At the far end, Dora Economides worked as a teacher and humanitarian aid worker in various countries around the world until she returned to Greece in 2009. Since the crisis broke out, she's been working as a freelance journalist, blogging on political and social issues as The Irate Greek. Writer and broadcaster Maria Margaronis has covered the Greek crisis for The Nation, where she's the London correspondent, The Guardian, the BBC, and numerous other publications. She's a faculty research fellow in modern Greek at Oxford. Professor Michael Jacobides holds the Sir Donald Gordon Chair for Entrepreneurship and Innovation at the London Business School. He's written for, as well as numerous prestigious journals, Harvard Business Review and the FT. His contacts in the world of business and politics have given him a ringside seat, sometimes I think closer than ringside, for the Greek government's attempts to turn the country around. He's currently leading the Redesign Greece initiative. So please join me in welcoming our guests. Give them a round of applause, is what I mean. And I hope we do bring light and heat to the subject. There will be arguing. I'm just hoping they won't argue in Greek, because if that happens, I will only be able to understand one word, and that's not the word you want to be translating in the Purcell room. So, we'll start. I want to start by setting the scene. What happened? I was in Davos in January 2010, and instead of the various luminaries that one thought would be attracting the media scrummage, there was a media scrummage around two very bewildered-looking men, who I actually didn't recognize one of them. One was Papandreou, the Prime Minister, the other is Papa Constantinou, the Finance Minister. And it was like two rabbits in the headlights. We just didn't know how strong those headlights were and how big a truck was coming down the road to get them. Not long after that, the crisis officially began. We all began to worry about Greece defaulting on its debts because it had discovered a huge black hole in its finances, undiscovered by Eurostat, undiscovered by the previous government, undiscovered by the Greek civil service. I can remember then saying to my bosses on Newsnight, this country is going to go through a 1930s-style crisis. Quite a hard thing to say in 2010 because everybody thought the recovery was underway globally. And it did. And my next strong memory of Greece is being on Syntagma Square. Well, they merge into one, to be honest, amid the social upheaval that then took place as people tried to oppose the various bailout deals, as we should call them. But let me go along the line and start with you, Dora, maybe, and say, can you give us a potted summary of what you think has happened to your country?
I would say that we always think of the Greek crisis as an economic and financial crisis, and that I believe that we are wrong to think that. This is above and everything else a political crisis. It's a crisis of a political system that is not able to serve the country. It is not able to operate. And unfortunately, because of the global economic and financial context and the specific context in Greece, it has evolved into something that is extremely worrying, namely the fact that fascism has become mainstream in Greece 4 years on. And when I say that fascism has become mainstream, I'm not talking about Golden Dawn. Everybody knows about Golden Dawn. I mean, I'm sure that it's been all over the news recently when some of the leaders were arrested. However, the problem is that this sort of authoritarian approach to power, of xenophobia, of sexism, nationalism, aggressive nationalism, has permeated very much every aspect of Greek political life. There have been policies adopted by the government, not only by the current government, but by governments since the start of the crisis, that have integrated elements of fascism that are extremely worrying. Random arrests, the story before the elections last year, a group of women who were HIV positive were arrested and thrown on television and accused of being prostitutes who were spreading AIDS in Greek society. That was a socialist party health minister. A little bit earlier, the Minister of Public Order, who would come out with statements saying that, oh, the immigration issue is like the issue of garbage. No one wants it in front of their door, but everybody has it in front of their doors. This is not something that you expect to come from a civilized politician. Some people who are in the government at this stage, the Minister of Health, who used, Antonis Georgiadis is someone who used to have a TV show, and among other things on that TV show, he used to promote and sell a book called Jews, the Whole Truth. These people are present in positions of power in Greece today. So to be talking about this as if it's an economic and financial crisis that can be dealt with in terms of economic indicators is wrong.
Dora, can I will bring my other two guests in, but let me ask you a brief reply to this, please. Do you think these were things, these very negative and for some people shocking things, phenomena, were just there stored up in Greek society? Have we, in other words, just seen the lid taken off a society that was in many respects unmodernized and unreformed?
There is an element that was there in the sense that Greek nationalism across history has tended to be on the aggressive side of things. This is just a fact, and it has gone through various different stages in history.
Although not with huge success.
Not with huge success, but since the end of the dictatorship, we had become a more developed country, I guess, in a sense, or a more democratic country. And even though these ideologies or behaviors were still there, they were marginalized politically, and they wouldn't express themselves in the public arena. Now they are perceived as perfectly legitimate in the public arena.
Michael, let me ask you what you think, give us your potted summary of what you think happened.
Well, I take a slightly different approach, and that is not to belittle the impact of the social pathologies that have been just described, that are very troubling and certainly will require to be thought of. But I don't think that we can separate the economic from the political crisis, especially in Greece. And the big problem in Greece is that you had a whole model of development which was based on the parties that essentially run the state creating wealth and affecting where wealth is created. So what we saw in 2010 and 2011 wasn't a crisis that had just brewed up. It was the result of a change in the model with which we produce for many years. Usually when people think about the crisis, they think about government spending, about the fact that we had 15% above what we earn as a state being spent. But the even bigger problem was that we had an equivalent figure in the current account deficit. How much more do we import rather than export divided by the country's production? So what did we do? We created a system that was etatist, but not etatist with some sort of central structure that would decide where investments go, but as a set of favors. And that started early on. That started pretty much with the structural programs of the European Union that bred not only entrepreneurship, but a set of people who were good at taking advantage at money funneled by the state. Then with the euro came lower interest rates and the possibility of borrowing easily. And as a result, various parties, and of course they were not all exactly the same, but we did have a huge increase in that. So we created an economic system that could not be sustained, which was anchored in a political system that was getting increasingly less accountable to society at large. And at some stage, you know, all parties end with a bad hangover, and we're still living the results of that bad hangover. And that can't change immediately. So it's a very difficult set of issues that we have tackled.
I'll bring you in a minute, Maria, but let me ask you a supplementary question then, because I think the critique you've outlined there is one I've heard from politicians and economists on all sides of Greek society. But the interesting thing for us outside is, what were the modernizers doing? What were the business school trained, university trained people doing going into a system that you're now describing, many other people, I don't care what side of politics, will accept is quite corrupt? What were people doing while that was going on?
Well, I think that if you look at the evolution of the Greek public administration, what you will see is the demise of the public service, the senior public servants, the people who are the general directors, over the probably from the 80s, almost uninterrupted until today. So the problem that we have right now is that the Greek administration is extremely thin. It is stitched together with Scotch tape and with needles. It's not something that is trained or is expected to work. What you did have, and that varied depending on the government, is that you had some people that would come and importantly go with each government, who are the advisors of the ministers trying to fix things here and there. We had some, and I think that what you saw was an effort to fix the macroeconomics of Greece just before and with the objective of entering into the euro. But once you entered the euro, and once Standard & Poor's and Moody's said, oh, Greece is safe, then there was no pressure for the political system to put up with any modernizers. They said, enough with that, we can keep a thin facade, but we don't need that stuff, we can get debt.
Okay, so we've had a crisis of a structural crisis, a classic structural crisis. You've framed the debate as a political crisis, and one in which you think the latent fascism in civil society is there. Maria, what about you? What do you think is going on?
Well, I agree pretty much with both of these views, but I would add to that that it's also very much a social and personal and psychological crisis, that what's happened is that the narrative people had about their lives, what had happened in the past, what they could expect in the future, has collapsed in a big way, and that this has been catastrophic, really, for all classes in Greek society. But before we talk more about that, I want to go back to what you said about when the crisis began. That's when the crisis hit the Western media big time. But the crisis, I mean, you could say it began in 1832, you know, when the Greek state was founded. It's never functioned properly, let's face it. But this particular wave of it, I think, became very visible. Well, we could go back to the Olympics, 2004. Vast spending. Remember all those stories, Greece won't make it, it's not going to work. And then we had this triumphal Olympic Games, you know, where, like Phidippides, who ran for a marathon and collapsed, you know, the runner died afterwards, if the runner is Greece. And back then, we had immigrants being swept up off the streets, we had cleanups in Athens, we had tremendous graft going on over construction projects, all these companies that were in bed with PASOK, you know, doing all this building for the Olympics. That was a real warning sign. 2007, we have the fires, the summer forest fires, and the Nea Demokratia government's absolute inability to deal with them, to respond, to put the fires out. And after that, an election called quite hastily. 2008, Lehman Brothers. That's a big world, you know, cataclysm. And I think the fact that in December 2008, Alexis Grigoropoulos, the 15-year-old boy, was shot and killed in Exarchia by a policeman, kicking off days and weeks of rioting by young people, kind of set off alarm bells. The idea that, wait a minute, Greece is not okay. Greece is a failed state, or it may become a failed state. So that then the ratings agencies started to circle.
The first downgrade was off the back of the December events.
Exactly. So that's when the financial speculators started to circle, and that's when the, you know, the public crisis began.
Let me ask you then, what is the effect? You mentioned at the beginning of your remarks, it's a personal and psychological crisis. What is the typical effect on people?
Okay, well, I'm going to tell you a dream I had last night. It's just one of those weird things. I dreamt that a friend of mine, who's an Irish journalist living in Greece, had written this sentence: all of us have become the domos of the Padang. And in the dream, I asked my husband, what is the domo of the Padang? And he said, oh, don't you know, it's an anthropological term. It means the person who becomes sick by trying to metabolize the sufferings of his tribe. And I think when I've watched my friends and family in Greece go through this, it began with a lot of kind of fascinated anger and analysis. What's going on? What's happening? We'll come to the media in a minute, but there's been this terrorism, you know, coming from the Greek television all the time. We're about to default. We're not about to default. It's going to be, taxes are going up. Taxes are not going up. Then there was rage. Then there was depression. And now there's a kind of numbness. And, you know, people's lives have changed radically, dramatically. In the sort of working class, the middle class, disaster. People are living on tiny pensions. People are struggling in every possible way. And people can see no future. So you have a society that is in a state of meltdown, although there are also lots of interesting initiatives going on and efforts which we should talk about also.
We will. Now, what we're going to look at next is the way the international media has covered it. Or we can broaden it, the international community. Let me just start by a personal recollection. I think it was in June 2011, during one of the many potential default crises on Syntagma, on Syntagma Square, the main square of Greece, of Athens, where we were trying to film not the most violent of any of the protests I've been on. And it always strikes me that this guy turned around, and in addition, whenever you are an English journalist, there is, for some reason, which we will maybe come to, an immediate assumption that you're a Zionist, which is what they mean is that you're a Jew. So we're surrounded by people who were on at that, but I'm used to that. What I wasn't used to was somebody putting their hand over my camera, and my cameraman says, "Look, don't you want us to tell your story?" And this guy said, "No, it's just too late for that." Now, I know many of us have had that problem. Let's go back along the line, because Maria, you are partly a London-based journalist, an outsider.
I am a London-based journalist.
What has the international media got right? What has it got wrong?
We're starting at this end?
Yeah.
Okay, well, the first thing I think that happened was that Greece became Greeks, rather than Greece, became the scapegoat for an international crisis of economy and finance. So that we had all these stories about the corrupt Greeks, the lazy Greeks, the skiving Greeks who don't pay their taxes, who retire at 52, who, which was deeply humiliating for people in Greece. And the apotheosis of this was that Channel 4 series, Go Greek, for a week. I don't know if anyone here saw it. It was really horrifying. It had British people supposedly pretending to live like Greeks by not paying their taxes. They had a hairdresser who decided she was going to retire at 53. And this was so insulting and so humiliating because British people live with a more or less still functioning welfare state, with a more or less functioning government, things that in Greece we just don't have. So that was the first thing. Then that kind of morphed into, there was a lot of financial journalism going on too. And I think that the biggest myth was that Greece was putting the whole Eurozone at risk. I think that this was a very important political myth that was used to enforce unacceptable measures in Greece. The idea that if we don't do this, Greece will have to default and the whole Eurozone will collapse. And that has never really been properly challenged. The idea that Greece was the weakest link, that it was going to break and the system was going to collapse. Then we got the propaganda of the sort of image of the suffering Greek, the poor Greek, looking for handouts and all of this, which was another sort of humiliation for people in Greece. And what we didn't have was a sense of history. Why has this happened? Where has this come from? And for a long time, a sense that ordinary people in Greece were not responsible in the same way as the politicians for what had happened. So that, yes, Greece had a public, still has a public sector based on clientelism and patronage. But if you are a 22-year-old from a village and your uncle says, here, this politician's going to get you a job and it's the only job going, what are you going to do? You're going to take the job. Is it your fault? No.
What do you think then?
Let me partly agree, but also partly disagree. On the agreement, I'd say that I don't think that Greece was the scapegoat per se, but that stereotypes were used by people who find it convenient to use stereotypes. And I think that there's an important distinction there. And I agree that what we saw and what we still see are the things that are extreme that sell. It's either right now Greeks needing to rummage rubbish in order to make a living, or some guy puffing a cigar, enjoying probably himself over a yacht and not paying any taxes, rather than looking at what is on average the reality, which is neither of these two extremes. It is hardship, there are problems, but not of the extreme way that are being described, nor of the tax evasion. There are very deep problems, but I think that the reporting tends to play to either the oh poor Greeks with schadenfreude, not with sympathy, but with a desire to create something that is consumed by the press. So this exists not necessarily because someone wants a scapegoat, but because press has its own rationale for making stories and selling stories. It's what you would expect. The second thing, though, and there I would disagree professionally, if I may, is the fact that it's all been something that, the problems with the Greek debt were not that consequential, and they were politically used. I frankly think that that is inconsistent with what we do know about what happened in the crisis.
It's not that I think they were, inconsequential. It's that I think they could have been solved in a very different way, given that Greece is only 3%
respectfully,
of
I think
GDP.
I think that's just wrong. We did not have, and the problem that emerged and is starting now to emerge through indirect accounts, which are consistent with what was happening at the time, is that people had no idea of how to sort out the problem. Now, of course, Greece played its hand remarkably poorly. That is, we did not push, but that was Greece's fault, that we could not and did not push when we saw the problem, not to simply finance ourselves in order to get out of that, but try to address it not as a liquidity, but as a solvency problem. So that was an issue. But at that time, international decision makers did not know how to deal with this on the global level. We had no template. So it was not as easy, and I don't think there was any guiding hands. People at the highest levels of, the fund, the US, wherever, were really at a loss on how to deal with it. The solution that was found was a solution that was very painful for Greece. Greece did not have any real part in shaping it, but it isn't that we had a menu of options available out of which we did not take some. That's just wrong.
Dora, the original question was about the international perception, but I can see you dying to get into this debate. So what do you think?
Well, I'm going to agree with what Michael just said, that apparently, yes, international leaders had no clue about how to deal with this crisis, and they just proved how totally incompetent they are, and they proved that they should not be international leaders.
What do you think specifically?
However,
now,
more generally, there are some things that I would like to add on what Maria said, and Michael as well. The fact that we were presented as the lazy Greeks. There were stereotypes. There were also outright lies. The fact, and those were used not only by the media, but also by political leaders. When Nicolas Sarkozy comes out and says that, all Greeks are civil servants, and Greece has this bloated civil service, well, the French civil service is much bigger than the Greek civil service, and you can check that on the OECD website. So there was an element of clearly propaganda and false information circulating. I also agree with Maria that there was a lot at one point, this focus on, these horror stories of people who don't have food, which is true. There is this situation in Greece. However, the fact that we never addressed the context of this, of how Greek society operates, the role of the extended family. The reason there are people going hungry in Greece right now is that the extended family safety net cannot operate anymore because the crisis is so deep. We never had a proper welfare state in Greece. This you will never see on the news. You will never hear stories of how grandparents are giving away all their pension to their grandchildren so that they can continue studying in a university in Yanina when the grandparents live in Crete. This you will never know, and there are these fantastic solidarity stories that don't make it up there. One last thing. One aspect that never makes it to the media, which is part of the horror story, what I call the horror stories, is Golden Dawn. Golden Dawn is all over the news. Golden Dawn is the bad guys, the neo-Nazis, they're stabbing people in the street, and it's true. Everything you hear about Golden Dawn is true, and reality is worse. However, there is, I'm getting back to it, the fact that some people have legitimized Golden Dawn. And when I hear that the center-right government of Greece is doing what it can to stop far-right Golden Dawn, what center-right government of the world has a health minister that used to sell a book called Jews, the Whole Truth?
Okay. I want to, because it's a question in my mind, so it must be in the mind of the audience. Just answer me if you can in one sentence, 2 sentences. What would you have done at the moment where, what would you have done different at the moment where they had to take the first bailout and accept the memorandum and take the, take the austerity package? Could Greece have done anything different, Michael?
Well, as I said, the first thing is how the memorandum was structured, and especially the first PSI, a story that's not told, which is simply horrific.
So this is the first private sector?
The first, yes, the one that was not implemented. We had the first PSI and then the second PSI. What is the problem, briefly? The problem is that we agreed to be financed for about 2 years before we restructured. All the debt that was financed from the time that we did that to the time that we restructured in last March is debt that belongs to the official sector, governments, ECB, IMF. This cannot be legally restructured. Hasn't been generally, and there's a big
to take
problem.
it out of economic language, you can't default on it.
You cannot default on that without, there is no legal way of defaulting it. You can do it only if you are a pariah state. And that is a very important problem that we put ourselves in at that time. But that's not the most important issue. The most important issue is that the structural reforms, what do we mean by that? Rationalizing, not just cutting the expenses, but rationalizing the public service. Doing things that we should have done forever. Having bookkeeping in hospitals. Being able to know how many employees we have. All these things are only now and very belatedly start to be implemented. What could we have done? Rather than muck about, continue exactly what we had, and simply pay money, we could have started restructuring the economy. And what has happened is that we have wasted 3 years doing almost nothing. If you ask civil servants, what has changed in their lives? In which way have they been pushed to rationalize their own bit of the civil service? You will see that extremely little had happened. So I think that the biggest difference could have been made if Greeks, not the international community, Greeks, the politicians, were a smidgen more reasonable and more honest in terms of the reforms.
Maria, let me bring you in.
Yeah, I agree. I think that at the beginning of the crisis, there was this split in Greece between people who thought it's all our fault and people who thought it's all their fault. And for some reason, it was very difficult for people to see it's both. So I agree, the memorandum was applied in the worst way possible, that is horizontal cuts, but no structural reform. But at the same time, I mean, you know, when you ask directions in New England, they say, well, I wouldn't start from here. And, you know, you wouldn't want to start from where you had to start from. But I think it would have been good if Europe's leaders had seen from the start that this was a systemic European crisis and thought about ways to address it at a European level, whether through Eurobonds or some other.
I think, I mean, obviously, you know, Trichet is gone. European Central Bank it did not sort of surpass itself in that period. I mean, we know, I was there at the G20 summit when I met somebody who'd just come out of the room who said Sarkozy took Papandreou by the lapel and shook him. Okay? So this is where we got to. I don't think there was a lot of sort of solidarity towards Greece coming from the international community. But what would you have done then, Dora? Because the left in Greece had said some said default, some said basically reject the memorandum. What would you have done?
Well, I don't know what I would have done in terms of economics because that's really not my field of expertise and there are people who are much more competent than me to talk about that. What I would certainly think we should have done differently is there's an issue of democratic legitimacy to what happened. You had an election in the end of 2009 where PASOK was elected in a landslide and on a platform of developing the welfare state, blah, 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 everything was going to be nice and shiny, and there was money. And then 6 months later, we get this memorandum forced down our throats and forced through parliament without a proper public debate because our media are so utterly incompetent and belong or are affiliated with the people in political or financial power. We never got a proper debate on what it meant for the country. And we never got a proper debate at the political level either. It was either you're with us, you support the memorandum because this is going to save the country, or you're against us and you're bad guys. And you want to destroy the country and take us back to the drachma. This is not a democratic debate. And there should have been a proper popular consultation, not to say a new election, after a healthy public debate before any of this happened.
Let me tell you a war story from that period. I think this happened to more than one journalist. We'd come across a younger generation of politicians and advisors and civil servants, and who were politicians. And one of them said to me, and they were not the only one to put this kind of feeling across, look, I have to go to a party event later. I won't tell you which party, but basically the idea was, look, I'm a kind of Western trained person, you know, I've been to university, and when I go to these parties, it's like that party in Godfather 2. Okay? It's like, except they haven't got as far as Michael Corleone has down the road of legitimizing the money. That is the problem. No, am I right? Am I right? Because, in other words, that's not a Greek thing, it's not an international thing. It's that the international economy has colluded with a bunch of people who, frankly, have not got as far down the route of legitimacy as the Corleones did. And some of them were leading parties. Correct?
That's my assessment.
What do you think, Mike? Am I too harsh?
I don't think you're too harsh, but I think that you're wrong in one thing, and seriously wrong. It's not the international economy. It is the Greek civic society. Yeah. It is the Greek political system that has colluded to that. And what we have created, and if you think about some of the discussions that are here today, for instance, people are speaking about what our options are. What you will see is that there are a few strong families in Greece. And if you look at the current roast of the Greek oligarchs, you will see that they have made most of their money directly or indirectly related with public procurement. And I think that that goes to prove the point. And my concern is that not only from all parties, especially from the left, the protectionist policies that you hear will ultimately lead to a Colombian structure whereby you have even stronger families and the state that either gives them money or is supported by them. So the problem comes to us understanding what the crisis is, and I hope that that will take us to the role of the media, because I think that the Western media will be faulted for what media should be faulted, which is that usually it focuses on what sells stories. But I think that the big problem is that Greek media has created a perception of the crisis that bears so little resemblance to the data on the ground that is shocking. And part of the reason for that is that media also depends and belongs to a similar spectrum of financial interests.
Okay, Dora, you come back, and then I'm going to ask Maria to give us the first, give us a little bit of an I'll warn you, a little bit of an overview of the Greek media for those of us who are not lucky enough to be able to consume it.
Dora should
Go on,
do that,
you start then, but you wanted to come in on that issue.
I wanted to comment. I mean, I agree with Michael that there is a real issue within Greek society, the Greek elite, the Greek oligarchy, and all this is absolutely true. However, they're not alone. They're really not alone. One of the biggest scandals we had in Greece these last years was the scandal involving Siemens, which is a German company. Another very big scandal we had was about submarines, the nuclear submarines that we bought from Germany. We bought 4, we got 1. The one we got was listing. It was going around in circles. We took it for repairs. Basically, yeah, we paid 10 times over those nuclear submarines, and they don't work. And we got them from a German company. Now, I cannot believe that the German government is not aware of the fact that nuclear submarines made in Germany are being sold to other countries. It just doesn't make sense that they wouldn't know that. So there is an element of collusion, of financial and economic factors that are outside of Greece. Another example, and I'm going to get to what you were saying about the media, is the issue of gold mining in northern Greece. There is this big plan by a Canadian company together with this Greek oligarch to create an open pit gold mine in a tiny area of northern Greece called Chalkidiki. It's a mountain area. Of course, once an open pit gold mine gets there, the area is going to be totally destroyed environmentally. The contract that the company has with the Greek government is such that the Greek state is not going to earn a single euro, of course, from all this. They won't get royalties for the land, they won't get anything. And this is a Canadian company, 95% Canadian, 5% Greek. 5% Greek is Mr. Bobolas, and Mr. Bobolas also happens to own 70% of Mega Channel, which is the biggest private TV station in Greece. When a demonstration happens in Chalkidiki, it always goes bad. People get beaten by the police, people get arrested, and then Mega Channel tells you that the terrorists are trying to prevent investment from happening in our country.
Totally different from the UK media, of course. Maria, what do you think? Look, you know, for people like me who kind of can't speak the language, I can only realise when a headline is sort of that big and it's you know next to a woman who looks like she's a drug user, it's probably saying something bad about her.
Yeah.
But you've got a better handle on it. Give us your view of the way they've
I'm going to
done
get some of this wrong because I don't live in Greece. So I come and go, and in the course of the last few years, as I've been trying to get, I've learned a lot about Greece that I didn't know before. But here's my sense of the Greek media. First of all, there is, you know, most newspapers and television channels are owned by the same oligarchs who are hand in hand with members of the government, both main parties. PASOK is now almost dead, but certainly Nea Demokratia. So, and there isn't a notion of objective journalism. Kathimerini, the main newspaper, purports to be objective and is, in some respects, you know, more professional. But it is also very much a government organ. And journalists have tended to work by rewriting press releases, which is really very depressing. I've been involved in reporting stories in Greece which were sort of not difficult to find, really not difficult to find at all. You just had to talk to people and look at the blogs and the Twitter sphere, but which no Greek journalists seemed to think were at all interesting or important until they were reported outside. So
well, let me just interject, because you are the person who reported first in The Guardian on the alleged torture of the anti-fascist protesters by police who are allegedly shouting at them. You are screwed now because we all support Golden Dawn.
Yes.
And until you'd done that and got the pictures...
Lots of people knew about it in Athens. I mean, how did I hear about it? I was reporting a feature on Golden Dawn and people told me about it, so I went to find out. But why did no Greek journalists do that? You know, why wasn't anyone else in that courtroom, you know, talking to the people who said they'd been tortured?
Michael, what do people say in your world, the world you move in, which is close to centres of power, close to businesses who are not oligarchs, like so, you know, the more modernised sector? What do they think about? Because you have to have a media to have a democracy. What do they think about what's been happening?
Well, I mean, there's two separate things. The first is what is the perception of where things are now, and the second thing is where are we with the media. I think that the biggest problem in terms of the media, and I think that there is some differentiation within Greece, is that there isn't as much, or rather, that some of the media are still pushing on lines that appear to be, you know, lines, quite literally lines,
yes,
that may not relate to real options. My biggest concern is the intersection between media and politics, and I think that the biggest problem that we have right now, and I think I'm probably echoing, as I'm also only occasionally toing and froing rather than being in Greece, is the fact that you have this absurd split between the pro and against memorandum, which doesn't make any sense on two counts. First, you know, you will need some financial support, so there are some parameters within which you have to act. And second, the way that you implement, the way that you sort healthcare, education, the social needs in a period of extreme crisis, all these things should be debated on an item-by-item basis. The paucity of any proposals by parties to say, how will we deal with this issue? You don't have debates on dealing with it, is related to the paucity of knowledge of the journalists about how we can deal with these issues. So, of course, there is a big problem, but I think that what's happening now is, speaking about the blogosphere, that even through all this clutter and through this huge white noise that is associated with that, you have seen the emergence of some more sensible journalism that is actually rooted in blogs. I mean, I'm thinking of things like Tofeleki or what have you, that started a bunch of people, have their own radio show and so on and so forth. That's on the media side alone. The other is a broader question.
I just want to say you've also got, which I think is really important, much more traffic between Greece and the outside world.
Absolutely.
There used to be much more of a firewall. But now, you know, there's eNet, there's eKathimerini, there's lots of English language blogs, which, you know, so there's the wall has broken down.
And may I just add one thing, because I think that we've only looked at the rearview mirror and we have looked at the worst sides of society. And frankly, any society, this society included, has got lots of things that are very ugly, but they are not in plain sight because it's trotting along. So we can forget the suffering that happens in any place. And in Greece, of course, you see it in its worst and most direct potential manifestation. But I do think that what the hopeful signs are is that over the last, I would say, year, having gotten through the denial, having gotten through the anger, I do sense that there is some desire more from the grassroots to try to improve. So I think that we would be hugely lopsided if we ended our conversation without considering what is changing, because what I see is a very difficult situation, but much greater optimism, even from the people that are involved in sort of making decisions and potentially allocating capital. It's not quite clear what's going to happen, but I think that at least the green shoots are there.
Let's not preempt that discussion, because I just want to give you one more chance, Dora, to come back. You are a blogger, and the first time I ever met you was inside Radio Bubble, which is a very nice miniature, smaller than that grand piano radio station in Exarchia. What do you think? Do you buy that? There has been this alternative, more entrepreneurial, younger answer to people who are not beholding to the whole structure
of the media.
Yeah.
Yes, I think that there is. It's not necessarily younger, though. There has been some. There has been some improvement. I will add something to what Maria said. Maria said that there's no such thing as objective journalism. I mean, in many ways, there's no such thing as independent journalism.
Yes,
and even if you go to left-wing papers, which are usually Avis is a left-wing paper. The information it prints is reliable. They won't make it up, as opposed to some...
But it is serious as paper.
But it's affiliated with a political party. It's openly affiliated with a political party. So when something goes wrong in Syriza, you really wonder if they're going to report it or not. The improvement there has been over, I would say, the past year and a half, is that some new publications appeared. There's a monthly magazine called The Unfollow that does mostly investigative journalism. There's Kostas Vaxevanis set up his own magazine.
This is the guy who was arrested for allegedly releasing the Lagarde list.
Yes.
Which is the list, for those of you who don't know, of... Go on, somebody tell us.
It's a list of people who have bank accounts in the HSBC branch in Geneva, and some of them at least are suspected of being tax dodgers. And he published the list, and he was arrested.
And the former finance minister seemed to lose it after he was given it.
Yes.
Well, that's the allegation.
It's been lost a number of times, actually.
But the guy who found it is on trial.
It's been lost by many people. And there is Eleftherotypia, which used to be a very good newspaper, went bankrupt, but then it restarted. But most importantly, for me, the most important thing that happened on the media scene in Greece in the past 2 years is Efemerida ton Syndakton, the editor's newspaper. It's a cooperative. It's owned by its own journalists. And it is, in terms of daily newspapers, it is the only truly independent newspaper.
And let me just interrupt, because you were the only one of us, I think, who was there when ERT was first closed and then revived. It's still going. Tell us just briefly about that.
Well, there was this. So this is another aspect of Greece walking away from democracy, when the government decided one nice day that they should close down the public broadcaster, which they decided at 2 p.m. and implemented. No, they decided at 6 p.m. and implemented at midnight. They shut down the TV, the radio, the magazines that went with it, the orchestras. We had one symphony orchestra in Greece. Now, officially, we don't have it anymore.
We do still have a symphony orchestra, but that's okay.
It's officially the only symphony orchestra was ERT.
Okay. But, so look, let me fast forward. It was then occupied by its own people.
It's been occupied by its staff. And now, because this is Greece in 2013, of course, this fantastic thing happens that on 11 June at midnight, ERT stopped broadcasting. But as of today, 19 October, 20 past 6 p.m. London time, ERT is still broadcasting.
Let me throw forward
because the staff are occupying the premises, they managed to keep a live stream going, they managed to get some transmitters up, they're broadcasting analog in most of Greece, they're even broadcasting digitally in some places, and you can watch ERT everywhere in the world. And of course, since they stopped being the public broadcaster, their reporting has become a lot more independent and a lot more interesting.
But does this quite speak to Michael's point in a way? Because isn't the problem whatever you think about it, the left state, the right state, the state seem to suppress a lot of the forces, whether you call them entrepreneurship, because setting up Radio Bubble is an act of entrepreneurship. Putting graffiti on a wall is a kind of an act of entrepreneurship. I mean, it takes a long time to make one of those stencils. You'll see tonight in one of in a documentary that we're showing tonight. For those in the business community, you say the answer is entrepreneurship. Sure, isn't the problem, though, that there's this huge weight of...
That's precisely right, but let me separate between that and another important dimension, which is, to me, perhaps the most hopeful sign, which is that what Greece lacked was civil society, not just entrepreneurship. And that is an important distinction. I think that what we saw and what was worsened over the last 25 years in Greece is that there was a very limited sense of community. The daily collection of rubbish from one of the big streets, the Ionia Odos, was around 5 tons of rubbish, people opening their windows and throwing rubbish. And this same lack of interest or respect for what might be the common ground is something that characterizes countries that ultimately fail, as we're now increasingly finding out in economics. I found it really weird,
though, because I, as an outsider, I found it much more highly networked, family-based, village-based than this country.
Two separate things. I think that what I'm referring to here, though, is the increase in some of the grassroots, not only entrepreneurship in order to make money, but efforts to try to improve collective spaces that I think are bubbling up.
I have to, or at least clarify what you said about sense of community, because there's been a very, very strong sense of community in Greece, but it is local. The loyalty moves out from the family to the village to the immediate.
I was speaking about civic society.
What there has always been, and there is still, is a profound mistrust of the state. So it's yes, this is my community, my village, you over there, the tax collector, the this, the that, I don't trust you.
No, I agree, but what I'm saying is that the more institutionalized efforts, things like Atenistas, for instance, trying to fix up parts of the city, the equivalent idea of neighborhood watches, I think that this is starting to emerge.
Absolutely.
And this is a very important distinction to allegiances that relate to family, that relate to village, that relate to political party.
Okay. Dora, let me just move it on, because we're drawing towards a close. We've got about 10 minutes. Where do you think it's going next? Or where would you like it to go next? What are your big fears? I want you to try and give us a sort of throw forward to this next bit.
Well, I would like it to become a more democratic country, which I think is what we desperately need at this stage. We need a country where people's voices can be heard, where their concerns can be addressed, and where being poor doesn't make you an enemy of the state. Because this is what we're living through right now. Being poor means that you cannot pay your taxes, and not being able to pay your taxes makes you an enemy of the state. Being the opposition makes you an enemy of the state. So I would like to have a more democratic country. However, I believe that it's going to get worse before it gets better.
You've said before you don't buy the sincerity of the crackdown on Golden Dawn. Obviously, there are questions to be asked by the media about why it was allowed to get so deeply into the state machine. But if what you're saying is right, then I think, doesn't the focus come back to the economy? Doesn't the focus come back to what is the economic answer? Do you feel the left has actually managed to answer that? What is the way forward? Do you feel there's anybody out there who has an answer?
I don't think that there is any. In my personal opinion, no. There is no specific political party that has an answer to what should happen. There are clearly some political parties that, in my view, are giving the wrong answer for sure. And I believe that the government line is absolutely wrong, in the sense that I truly believe that integrating elements of fascist discourse in your own discourse in order to get the votes back from the fascists doesn't get you the votes back from the fascists. It legitimizes the fascists, and why would people vote for a half-baked fascist when they can go and vote for the real thing?
Michael,
I believe that this is going to backfire big time.
Let me ask you then to throw forward. We might be seeing a third bailout, a third austerity package. This is in the air. Do you think there's a lot of talk that the economy's turned? Do you think it has?
Well, I think that the economy has stabilized. I have to say that last year, this time, I did not think that Greece would be here. No. I was seriously concerned that things would have literally fallen apart and that we would be in civil unrest that would be very, very difficult to imagine. But if you look at the facts of the ground, actually possible and still possible. things have stabilized financially. So the two things that I think are important is that in a very, very bad and crude way, we are now not spending more than we're earning, but most importantly, we don't depend on imports as much as we did. And once you get these two, you start having policy options.
Where is the turnaround coming from in the current account balance? What's changed?
Well, in terms of turnaround, there is imports started very low, but they have increased substantially, and we do see that. So we see some adaptation.
Yeah.
Sorry, exports are starting to increase, although they did start quite low. And obviously consumption has stopped substantially, and consumption had a very big import component. What I'm concerned with is less the macro stuff. On the macro stuff, if you look at the figures, Greece has actually managed to stabilize itself reasonably well, although by implementing things that have huge social pain. The big concern that I have is that beneath the surface, there's many structural issues that have not been addressed.
And what we mean by that is that then the growth can't happen. Because if you have an airport
precisely.
that nobody wants, really, you're never going to be able, you can't privatize it
Precisely,
again.
and I think that here the question is, it's an evolutionary struggle. How will you allow the new to push the old out? And how will you, rather than just pushing on the measures that are hitting the civil servants, for instance, how will you have the people that do have both the desire and the meraki, to use a Greek word, in this dilapidated administrative infrastructure to push forward, which is part of what we're trying to do with redesign.
Let me ask you the same question.
Okay. The signs of hope are to do with, I agree with Michael, something is changing in Greece, and that has to do with the things people have had to do in order to survive, to help each other. Food pantries in suburbs of Athens like Neonia, all these solidarity projects, all of that. That's a really positive thing. Some of it's entrepreneurial, some of it's not, like the workers at the Viome factory in Thessaloniki who've taken over their plant, and although they can't produce, glues and things anymore, they're producing cleaning products, and they're making a sort of a living for themselves and their families. But the structural issues are profound. And when you have a government, for example, that has put now in charge of the Ministry for Administrative Reform the son of a former prime minister, who was also the brother of a former foreign minister, and who was himself implicated in the Siemens scandal, you really start to worry. I mean, don't they realize that to have a nepotistic candidate in charge of administrative reform, whatever else his qualifications might be, is sending the wrong message. So we have that. We have, as Dora has talked about, the connections between the government and far-right elements. The collapse of democracy, not only because of Golden Dawn, but because under pressure from the Troika, a democratic process in Parliament has been suspended, laws are passed by decree, and so on and so forth. But what I'm worried about is that is the continuity with the past. So that the model for economic development in Greece before the crisis was tourist development, building. The two main earners in Greece have always been shipping and tourism. We have a new law now on the books which lessens protection for forests. I'm expecting to see more forest fires next summer because of this. And we do have small entrepreneurial projects going, but we also have an attempt to attract foreign investors at any cost. And so what I'm worried about is we'll see what is sold as a success story, an economic recovery, which is an economic recovery for large corporations, for Greek oligarchs, for outside investors, but not for the ordinary people in Greece, or for the many thousands of migrants who now live in Greece and who are trapped there by European Union policies.
I should just say that the Dublin II Treaty basically means if you're a migrant and you get to Greece, and even if you get out, you're supposed to be sent back. And, and of course, it is not myth that there are many, many single male migrants. I've covered the story a lot, a disproportionate amount of them compared to probably most other cities in Europe.
Unless we have a different European migration policy, we'll keep seeing tragedies like Lampedusa, and Greece will remain a kind of prison camp.
Well, it's like Whack the Mole, basically. They stop it in one place and then Lampedusa happens. I would expect it to start again in Greece.
It would,
But, final bit, okay. A slight veer, rather than what's the future. Let me ask you this. We in Britain, and we've seen it earlier in the afternoon and we'll see it tonight, are slightly enthralled to your country intellectually. We know some of its poets. We certainly know its philosophers, and we get taught those philosophers at a very early age. We've all seen various movies, and we'll have our stereotypical view of Greek society. But while this has been going on, what's been happening to Greek intellectual life? Has there been a response to the crisis that we will look back and say, you know, that was the X school, whatever it was? Dora, would you start?
Well, last year I did a series of radio shows on culture in the time of the crisis, and it was interesting to see that in the beginning I thought that I would work on, you know, squats and graffiti and these things, which are obviously very interesting for a million reasons, but the situation for those so-called alternative forms of art hasn't really changed since the crisis. These are people who were broke before the crisis, they're still broke now, and they're still doing what they used to do, and they're doing it very well, but it's not new. What was really interesting was in the formal art sector. There was this play, To Megalo Mas Circo, or Great Circus. It's a satirical play about the history of Greece that was written during the years of the dictatorship. And it was being staged again for the first time since the end of the dictatorship by the National Theatre of Northern Greece last year, in late 2012, early 2013. Between August 2012 and January 2013, when I interviewed them, 270,000 people had seen the play. It's huge. We're talking about a country of 10 million people. This is a very, very big number for an actual theater play. And people, there has been very clearly a rebirth of political art in Greece since the crisis. Okay. And this is something that I find very positive.
Michael, you had a different take when I spoke to you before about what happened to the Greek intelligentsia.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that to a large extent what happened is that the Greek intelligentsia, the one that is based in Greece, is largely involved in the party mechanism in the lower or capital letter P. If you think about my colleagues economists, it is true that you might expect to be handed the chairmanship of a big bank or another association or of any other nice non-for-profit. One of the things, by the way, that the government has not closed is 1,624, I've seen the list, organizations that exist that had no particular reason, but they still have, even those that don't employ people, paid members of board of directors. So the state hands over nice goodies that enhance the life of people in intellectual life in Greece. What does that mean? Well, that means that perhaps you didn't originally mean to, but you start being a little too cozied up with the local establishment, and you don't want to disappoint some of your friends. And I think that that limits your possibility of being objective. And by the way, since you made a mention about people and how they're used, I might suspend this belief and ask for all ministers, not only the example that you used, to look at what are the outcomes. And the problem that we lack in Greece is the measurement of what people do rather than only who they are or where they're associated from, which would be a wonderful thing if the press started doing a little bit more of. What's happening now, in terms of the second part of your question, I think that not necessarily in the established part of the Greek intelligentsia, but more in terms of what I see bubbling up, there are questions that are starting to be asked on what are the constituent values of society. And for all the pain and suffering that has brought about these questions, that is good, because without the self-doubt and the examination of what's gone wrong, and of course we will all have our own strong views on that, we're not going to be able to go forward. So it's a fragile period, but you know, things might just bubble up.
Yeah, Let me give you the last word, because it will be the last word.
I think that there is, I agree with both of you really, that in the sense that there has been a new life, intellectual and cultural life in Greece, which is very, very exciting. And some of it, a lot of it is in the cracks, in those sort of, you know, occupied theatre spaces or on the streets or wherever. And that's really heartening to see. But there's also new film, new writing going on, new poetry. I've forgotten what I was going to say.
I'm asking, is there a trope? Is there a trope of the crisis that we could identify and say, this is it? You know, it's there across right, across left.
I don't think so. I think what people have, it's been like picking up the stone and seeing the creepy crawlies underneath, and then you pick up the next stone and there's more creepy crawlies underneath. It's like Greece has been flayed to the bone, and people are having to face, you know, what we really are. The next big thing that I think has to be faced is history, because we've seen, you know, the old historical tropes of the Civil War and so on, and the dictatorship sort of being recycled in a rather unthinking way. And there are some very exciting projects going on about that too. There's a historian called Sulla Vervegnotti in Kypseli in Athens who's doing an oral history project with people about their history. We have to tell the past differently if we're going to have a different future.
Well, on that, it's a great end, and I want to try and wrap up by saying my two penneth on this was I couldn't understand why, having been on Syntagma and been in Exarchia and been on demos, been out into the countryside, why there hadn't been, in fact, a social breakdown and, in fact, an eruption until I went to Skilatico. And there, if you don't know it, there's a lot of people in a lot of spandex hot pants, and they spend a lot of money on fake flower or real flowers, and they throw them at some very good-looking men and women who sing a very popular version of Bazookia. And I kind of did get I did understand at last what it was, that for those young people, what it was that was, and I think, therefore, in other words, coming back to the outsider's view of Greece, I think those of us who have tried to cover it, we're on a voyage of discovery from macroeconomics to dog music. And on that, I will say there will be some very non-doggy music tonight. If you are coming tonight, there's going to be the Cabaret, Crisis Cabaret, hosted by one of the funniest women on earth, Katerina Vrana. And there's going to be Rebetiko, there's going to be a bit of modern Greek documentary making, there's going to be some singing, there's going to be a one-act play, it's going to be everything, but it won't happen unless we stop, get out of here so they can reset the set. Thank you to my guests, thank you to you.
The Greek media has really struggled to tell the truth, to be honest. It's been the newspapers largely owned by kind of family concerns, often quite aligned to the existing political parties. They have a particular stance. Whole huge stories happen without being covered. They literally get no coverage in the mainstream newspapers. Then you've got the TV stations. I think a lot of Greek people find it very difficult to take them seriously. However, there is a vibrant Greek alternative media, and I don't mean a kind of anarchist type website. I mean journalists who've been lost their jobs, laid off, gone on short time, gone freelance, have over the 3 years I've been covering this gradually managed to get quite a vibrant alternative voice going. And one of the things we're doing here at the Purcell Room today is to hear from people who've been through that, been through the whole cycle of trying to rebuild a truth-telling media when the mainstream has failed, I think, quite dramatically. Those of us who cover Greece think it'll probably be needing a third bailout, it'll probably need a third austerity package. This is what the IMF, European Union, are pushing right now. If that happens, I think the economics of the situation will be again sorely tested. But my real concern is the social fabric of the country. We know that when crises happen, the depression in Europe was over by 1933. Economically, it was a recovery. The real hardship was 33 to 36. So we may have 3 to 5 years of further hardship, further breakdown, further social stress to come in Greece. And the worry is, can society take it?